Hi Nick,
Hello. Hey, how's
do
it
you hear
going?
me? Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Yeah, it's really good to see you again and to be talking.
Yeah, yeah. So Nick, thanks for coming back on again. I'm just going to record all of this because we only get like 40 minutes anyway on the free version of Zoom or whatever. So you wanted to thanks a lot for coming back on, and basically your the idea today is that you want to talk about Keynesian economics. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I can give you a little bit of background as to why. Currently on my channel, we're reading through a new book, and it was voted by my audience to read this book. It's called Fabian Freeway by Rose Martin. It's from 1966. It's pretty expensive. There's not that many copies floating around online, and I managed to track one down. And so we've been working our way through that. And this name keeps coming up, John Maynard Keynes. And I
Yeah,
know this name, and I know that he is connected with economics, which is what reminded me of you and your videos and your
yeah, yeah,
past as an economics teacher. But
yeah.
what is really interesting is that the thesis of the book is that John Maynard Keynes' role was to basically collapse capitalism over the long term, right? Because this book is about the Fabian Society, and
Yeah,
their emblem is the wolf in sheep's clothing or the
yeah,
tortoise because they look to do things over massive spans of time, right?
yeah.
And so his name keeps coming up in this book all the way through. But if you go onto his Wikipedia page and you try and learn about him there, it's a massive article, but it doesn't say
Oh
anything
yeah, and there'll be
about any of these people.
loads of gobbledygook on it as well. Yeah. So I agree completely with your assessment so far. In that, in my view, Keynes was very much advocating for technocracy. So his line, the standard line from Keynesians is, "Oh, free markets fail." Um, so government is needed to come in and intervene and fix these market failures.
Mhm.
So yeah, but like basically Keynesianism is all about trying to justify growing the state, and then
Right.
new things can be added into that, like I don't know if you've ever come across this guy, Gary's Economics, but he's a classic kind of. I'm not sure whether he's 100% legit or whether he's just an E17 actor,
This
right
is the guy
behind
who
him.
makes videos in his kitchen, doesn't he? With the
Yeah,
cup of tea in front of
yeah,
him, and
yeah,
he's
yeah.
like just an
With
everyday bloke. Yeah.
exactly with super high production values as well. With all lighting and stuff like that. So straight away, that makes me suspicious. But people like him, they push the income inequality line as well. That
Right.
the government needs to step in and do something about that, which is, you know, these people love to present themselves as being super moral, when in fact, what they're justifying is theft. For people to be sent bills by some, a corrupt cartel of people calling themselves politicians. And if you don't pay what they say you owe them, they send the boys around and throw you in a cage. And then they take your money and then they give it to other people that they think are more deserving of it than the person that earns it themselves.
Right. Yeah,
It's
exactly. And it was funny. I just
this,
caught up with the latest video you uploaded, and in that you said the most immoral people of the lot are socialists.
yeah,
And that's exactly what this book is about. And so as part of this series that I've been making is reading about, okay, well, what's socialism? And it's so fascinating that Marx used the word socialism and communism interchangeably, and
yeah,
Lenin says that socialism is the transitionary period between capitalism and communism.
that's
Okay.
right. That's
And
right.
then you've got this group coming along. They meet in 1884 and they get together, and they're basically a bunch of middle class, bored atheists.
Yeah,
And because I think they've born into and been indoctrinated into this Darwinian worldview of, well,
yeah.
human beings are just animals, and we happen to be here with lots of money and well
Oh,
bred and good
I think
education.
Nick, just one sec. I think it's more sinister than that. There's
All right.
also an element of social Darwinism. So these
Right.
people self-proclaimed intellectuals, aren't they? Maybe I don't know whether Mensa existed in their day, but the sort of people that brag about being a member of Mensa and how they,
Yeah.
which Cambridge college they attended. These people are very, very dangerous because they actually I used to know a GP who was, again, like, he was like, at its most benign, you could say he was authoritarian but paternalistic. It's like, oh, the poor plebs, they can't run their lives themselves. They make stupid decisions. So what we need to do is to grab hold of the levers of power and just manipulate them, move them around, tell them what to do, and get them to follow our instructions, and then their lives and society, it'll all be a lot better, you see. And we can't allow them free will,
Yeah.
to make their own.
That's so aligned. That's so aligned with what I'm reading in this book. There's a quote from a Guardian article attributed to Keynes, and he's saying the working class are too drunk and ignorant to be trusted to keep their numbers down.
Yeah,
And it turned out that this guy was actually the director of the British Eugenics Society for a
yeah,
decade.
yeah. And before that, Thomas Malthus said very similar things about the poor breeding too much and doing things that he disapproved of. But this is what nudge theory is all about. I remember when I was teaching, I wrote an article about it. This is like years ago, about probably nearly 10 years ago now, pointing out the dangers of this behavioral economics, which basically assumes that mine and your subjective preferences, based on our individual tastes, are irrational. I used to go and watch football I used to live in Guildford, as you know, and I used to go and watch Morecambe play football. So it'd be like 4 hours on the train, spending over 100 quid to get there and back. I'm sure somebody, one of these Mensa members would say, "Oh, that's irrational. What are you doing? We need to change your behaviour, and if we nudge you in a particular, you'll be better off. Trust us, and
It's
society will
for
be
your own
better off."
good.
And it's for your own good, and it's for, even if you disagree, we're still going to impose our will on you for the greater social good. It'll be better for society.
Yeah.
And so these
Incredible.
people are just power hungry monsters who try to hide behind this fig leaf for the greater social good, which is no different from what Adolf Hitler did. Hitler was all about the Reich and the Volk, and the individual must give up his or her free will for the greater social good. It's pure National Socialism.
But then, and that's the thing, people forget that his whole thing was socialism. And
Yeah,
yet they'll walk around and call themselves socialists or communists,
yeah.
and they'll
It
kind
was
of brush over and overlook the incredible amount of death and destruction and all the starvation that went
yeah,
on under those systems.
yeah, and it was pure technocracy. It was pure technocracy. It was like, who decided what things were going to be produced in Nazi Germany? Was it the invisible hand of the market and consumers, millions of consumers making sovereign decisions individually? It wasn't. It was basically the Nazi Party had this institution called the Tort Institute, and they decided what was going to be produced and in what quantities. And they gave production quotas to nominally privately owned businesses, and those private businesses better produce what the Nazi central planners had told them to produce. Otherwise, it was off to the camp for them as well. They
Wow.
decided on the production methods, and of course, they decided which people in Nazi Germany was going to consume, the share of the nation's output. They played social justice games as well. Their social justice was transfer income and assets from Jews and to give it to more deserving Aryans. But
It's amazing how it doesn't take long to start learning about these things to realize that socialism, communism, technocracy, it's
it,
all tied up. It's all the
it's
same
all the
thing.
same. It's all the same. Fascism, communism, socialism, they're all forms of technocracy. So it's the government that decides what's going to be produced, how it's going to be produced, and for whom. Whereas
So do you think
the system that I favour is the free market, where individuals make those decisions from the bottom up through this decentralized process of casting economic votes every day in an economic election,
so?
and
So when you were
we decide.
teaching and you were having to stick to, I guess, curriculums and predefined modules, did you find it challenging in that the
Yeah,
dominant model was Keynesianism economics, but you knew
Yeah, yeah.
of better ways. And yeah,
100%. The only I used to look for opportunities to kind of enlighten them. So in the microeconomic syllabus, there was right at the very beginning of it, there was a section on economic systems. So it was like the planned economy, the mixed economy, and the free market economy. So all the textbooks used to present the planned economy as being synonymous with, USSR, or yeah, it was that basically communism. But what I made sure that I taught the kids was that fascism was also an example of a society that ran a planned economy. There was no economic freedom in Nazi Germany. It was the state that decided the big economic questions or answered them. But somehow I don't know how they've done it, Nick. But like, if you ask a person on the street, they'll go, "Oh, if you favour like freedom of speech, then that's right wing, and that makes you a Nazi." So it's like, were the Nazis in favour of free speech then? So then, I might do things like, flash up an image on a PowerPoint of some Nazis burning some books.
yeah,
How
yeah, and
about
make a
that?
point. Yeah, it's incredible the associations that have been planted in people's minds. And it's one of the things that I made a short video about it. What is right-wing extremism? And it's very
Yeah.
much connected in people's minds with things like patriotism, nationalism, with getting married and having children, with free speech, as you mentioned, with wanting to own property, with even things like doing exercise. And there's even like headlines
Yeah,
out now,
yeah.
the
Oh,
right wing, the white supremacist origins of exercise.
it's ridiculous. Rather than the libertarian view is like let people do what they want. People who want to exercise, great, but it's a private matter, isn't it?
Well, one of
Whereas
the interesting things that came up as well when I was doing a bit of an intro reading for this book was I looked at the Wikipedia article for socialism, and it's a very long one, and then also communism. And on the communism one, it talked about how in the USSR, it said it was the first sort of centrally planned economy of its historically, it was the first one. And then it gave you some details about the famine, and it said
yeah,
between 1 and 10 million people died in the first famine. And I thought,
yeah,
hell, that's quite a spread. They did
yeah,
1 in 10
yeah. Well
million.
done. Yeah,
And then there was a second famine, and it just said millions died in that. And then at the very
yeah.
end, the last sentence was the way that it was alleviated was to grant private ownership to small and medium-sized enterprises. It
Well,
literally tells you that on
yeah,
Wikipedia.
yeah. No, but one thing that I would say, Nick, is, and this is just entirely an independent thought from me, is, if you were to look at, like, I don't know, the Middle Ages, for example, I think what was happening there was fairly close to a planned economy back then. The central planner just being the king or the queen or the emperor, and you basically there was no private property rights back then. Uh, Even in the UK, after 1066, and you had the people from France coming over, basically in feudalism, wasn't it? Basically, people had no private property, and they were told what to do by the lord of the manor, or the aristocracy, the French aristocracy.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think it kind of reminds us that the labels and the names given to the systems have changed over the years, but actually the structure is basically remained, a kind of pyramid with a small elite clique at the top,
Yeah,
creaming it up and living the life, and with most of the wealth and the privilege and the control
yeah,
and the power, and then everyone else kind of underneath them. And they'll every so often they'll kind of throw off one outfit and put on a new one and say, "Oh, we've just liberated you from that evil
yeah.
monarchy royalty system that you used to have, but now you're in a liberal democracy. Isn't that fantastic? Look at the
But
progress we've made."
I think one thing that I'd add to that though too is the human desire for freedom is unquenchable.
Right.
That eventually people will they realize what's going on, they desire freedom, and people will make all sorts of sacrifices for freedom. And
Yeah.
if you look at what happened in the UK in the sort of, I don't know, 18th and 19th century, and in America, for a brief moment in time, we actually had something quite close to economic freedom, you know, which basically saw canals, roads, railways, hospitals, schools, you know, most of the infrastructure that's, you know, sewerage systems, much of it is still being used today. Drum roll, that was built with private money via the profit incentive. And
You
that
can't
and
say that.
that led to huge improvements in living standards. You know, monumental. Before that, people were kind of peasants on the land, you know, dying in their 30s. You know, during the Industrial Revolution, people of their own free will moved to like the first, you know, modern cities in the world, like Manchester. No one forced them to move there, but they moved there because, although by modern standards, the standard of living wasn't great, but it was a miles higher than what they had previously when they were like landless peasants. And this again is what Keynesians would like. Oh, are you suggesting going back to, you know, the 19th Victorian times? And don't you, you know, it's almost as if they think, well, I want to revert back to 19th century technology. It's like, no, what I'm arguing for is imagine a situation where there was economic freedom with 2024 technology that, well, again, we can see it. You know, if you think about countries like South Korea and Hong Kong, you know, not so long ago, those were economic basket cases. But through relatively free markets and private property rights, those countries have now overtaken us in terms of living standards in the space of a generation. Whereas the countries that embrace Keynesianism, socialism, technocracy, whatever you want to call it, like Britain, living standards have collapsed. You know, if I think I'm
Yeah.
59 and, you know, when I've been back to England, it's just depressing just how far living standards have fallen in my lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. I see it everywhere now. Manchester City Centre is my local city, and we go in there every so often, and it's a really grim experience. And you can, you know, I feel like we're not too many steps away from seeing people just using needles in the streets and having intercourse down alleyways. It doesn't feel like we're that far away from the
Yeah,
that kind of level of degeneracy and decline.
yeah,
And it's a very thin line that's keeping us from that. But you see a lot of people passed out. I walked past a guy who'd like wet himself and was just lying in a puddle, passed out.
yeah.
And it's dark and it's a very uncomfortable scenario to walk around and be in that, and yet be told, you know, that you're in a first world country and you should be lucky for living here. And
and and
we've got
and
lots
and
of
and thank goodness for the NHS and the welfare state. You know, just imagine if libertarians like Watson had his way and we had no welfare state, what would, well, you know, it doesn't work, does it? You know, your observations, Nick, about the way that Manchester is now prove that the system doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's
And the other
terrible.
thing is like the actual the complete it's a total melting pot now, not just in the city centers where it used to be, everywhere, small towns, you know, my town is a very small town, a couple of towns around here, you drive through them and you can see the influence of other cultures, other languages being written on the signs. You can feel whole areas that don't feel British. And then
Yeah,
also the next question from that is what even is British now? A lot of people, you could ask them, you could probably go to school and say, okay, what does it mean to be British as opposed to another nationality? I'm not sure they'd be able to tell you. I kind of feel like there's been a cultural destabilization. That's
yeah,
another sort of effect of this long-term change that
yeah,
the likes of the Fabian Society have been implementing
yeah.
for over 100 years.
It's almost like they chose to deliberately import low productivity, low skilled labor. People, you know, and I don't blame, you know, for me as a libertarian, I would have no border controls whatsoever. I wouldn't, after what happened in 2020, you know, it's a very powerful argument that the government should have no say whatsoever in deciding when and where you can travel or when and where you can live. You know, we can't trust politicians with that power. But to have open borders, you need to get rid of the welfare state completely. It needs to go. All of it needs to go because
It's
if
too
you,
strong an incentive, isn't it?
yeah, exactly, exactly. So I don't blame these people. You know, if you were some sort of semi-literate goat herder from northern Pakistan, and you know, and somebody was offering you a free flat and I don't know, like 100 quid a week in welfare benefits and free education for your kids and free healthcare, and you can bring your granny over and she can get a free pension as well. Well, like of course people are going to move over, but the problem is it then just has like fiscal implications. You know that you end up with a massive fiscal deficit. Government spending explodes. The people that you've brought in don't have the skills to make a contribution to the economy. You know, so they'll always be claiming more benefits than they'll be paying into the system. So you basically end up with what we've had: massive fiscal deficits, government spending being miles higher than tax income. And then what happens is, you know, that the government then will just go, oh, well, sorry, Mr. Hayes, you're going to have to pay more tax to close the fiscal deficit. Yeah. And then what that means, you know, your council tax goes up as well. And what that means is that you don't have any money, you don't have any disposable income left because too much of it is being stolen by the government. So then, you know, out in you know, North Lancs in Burnley or Rochdale where I was, there's no money going in the tills of pubs, restaurants, or other private businesses because the local councils have killed off those businesses through high rates of local taxation.
Yeah.
So it's just,
so one of the things that I wanted to ask, and
yeah,
if see if this is your understanding, is in the book, Roselle Martin, she is asserting that Keynes or Keynes, I'm not sure, she calls
you
him
could
the
say it both.
father.
You can say
Yeah.
it both ways, Nick.
She says he fathered the theory of deficit spending. So
Yeah,
the implication is kind of that he came up with this bright idea of why don't, if you're a government, why don't you just spend a lot of money you don't have? And the suggestion is kind of prior to that, that wasn't happening so much. Perhaps there was a resource like gold backing the currency.
yeah,
And
yeah.
was Keynes actually instrumental or played a big role in saying, okay, well, let's ditch that idea. Let's loan
One
lots of
hundred
money into
percent,
existence with our banking friends and
one
spend and
hundred
keep things
percent,
going that way. Right.
100%. Keynes basically came along and said, um, before the 1930s depression, there'd been a big boom before that, a lot of borrowed money, private borrowing, people speculating on shares. You know, Wall Street crash was the end of that cycle. But basically, Keynes came along and said, "Oh, the problem is we've got a lack of spending in the economy." Um, the reason for that was that basically people had borrowed too much during the previous boom, the Roaring Twenties, and they were now in a period where, you know, banks had gone bust. They couldn't make loans anymore to people. People who were in a position to try to pay down their debt started to do that. So, you know, as people paid down their debts, demand fell. And what Keynes said is that, oh, that causes unemployment. So what governments need to do is to run fiscal deficits. They need to spend more money than they collect in taxes and finance that by printing bonds, which is like a divisible loan, basically, that people buy as a fixed interest investment. Yeah. So Keynes, the problem with this though is that is well, there's a couple of problems with it. First off, is that what if the plebs choose to spend the money that the government's injected through deficit spending on imports rather than domestically produced goods? You know, will that increase domestic employment? No, it will increase employment in the country that you're importing the goods from. So Keynesianism certainly doesn't work now because the UK's been deindustrialized. You know, so
Yeah.
and then the second problem is that by the government borrowing money today, it'll increase the amount of spending in the future that the government has to make on debt interest.
Mhm.
And then on top of that, at some point, the government's going to have to try and start to repay some of the money that it's borrowed. So, you
Kicking the
know,
can down the road.
what deficit spending does is it pulls forward expenditure that would have occurred in the future into the present. So when the
Right.
future arrives, you're up the creek without a paddle. Like, you know, basically the crash that you try to postpone through deficit spending is even bigger than it would have been had you just let it happen.
You're
You know,
you're
it's
you're magnifying the catastrophe, but you're just
yeah,
pushing it a little bit further away and
yeah.
refusing to look at
Here's
it. It's like bottling emotions or avoiding
No, Nick,
that drip.
I've
Like,
got Nick, I've got the perfect analogy, right? So imagine that you've been a naughty boy and you've had a night out on the razzmatazz. You know, you've had a few too many shandies, and you wake up in the morning with a hangover, too much debt, yeah, and you're not feeling well, things aren't working too well. The Keynesian solution is the hair of the dog. It's to reach over, get the glass of whiskey, load up with more debt, and
keep
just
going.
mask the symptoms. But then again, once that wears off, then the next time you get a hangover, it's even worse. And that's basically what Keynesianism has done to us. We're in this debt
Fantastic.
spiral.
That's a
And as the
fantastic analogy.
and as the government gets deeper and deeper into debt, you can see it now, the amount of money that the government is spending on debt interest. It's like miles more than what we spend on education. So
Wow.
this is a problem. This is a massive problem. If people are paying taxes and most of it is going out of the door in debt interest, that's a problem.
And one
But
of the things that
politicians,
really stood out to me as well when I was learning about this, particularly reading about this gentleman on Wikipedia, it never mentioned fiat money. It never mentioned
no,
central. I mean, he was the director of the Bank of England for a while as well,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it never mentioned the creation of fiat money or how it's
nope,
created, loaning it
nope,
into existence, charging
yeah,
interest on lending it out, this whole
yeah,
system, and the role that plays. Instead, all the detail of his ideas and his theories for me as an untrained kind of layman, I've struggled to wrap my head around the sort of the economics. So I
yes.
appreciate your lessons and your analogies. It really
But
helps me
but but there's
understand these things.
there's another problem, Nick, that I've not even mentioned, which is when governments run fiscal deficits, when they spend more than they collect in tax, that's financed through selling these bonds, gilt-edged
Right.
securities, which is basically a form of broad money. These bonds perform, store of value function of money. Um, so basically, what you're doing is increasing the money supply. When governments run fiscal deficits, end up increasing the broad money supply because bonds count within the broad money total. So what then happens is that the money supply starts growing faster than the economy. So you've basically got too much money chasing too few goods. So of course that pushes the price level up. So when we saw this was why there's been devastating inflation in Britain, because what happened was there was massive fiscal deficit. So the money supply grew really quickly. So total expenditure, is naturally going to rise, assuming that people spend the money at the same pace as they always did. But also at the same time, the lockdowns crushed production. So you actually had more money chasing fewer goods. So it was a double whammy on inflation. And that's why there's been this, horrible cost of living effect.
Yeah. Excellent summary. And I think that was one of the key aspects of the big C event that people don't look at. A lot of people argue about the origin of the so-called tiny particle and the where it came from and how it exit and all
Yeah,
the rollout of the experimental injections, et cetera, et cetera. But what about seeing that event as an economic attack on certain
yeah,
places? Certain
yeah,
places had a much stronger, more severe economic attack than others did. And I think
yeah,
when you say the word deindustrialized to describe what's going on in Britain, you're hitting the nail on the head there. And it's a word that
yeah,
I think more people should get used to hearing and using to describe what's going on when they're trying to point this out to other
yeah.
people.
You'd also cite Yuri Bezmenov, demoralisation.
Yeah.
So you take away meaningful jobs where people are producing cars or TVs in Britain. When they're doing when they go to work, they can see that they're actually producing things that are useful, things of value that people actually consume. These days, what's happened is that we've replaced those jobs with what David Graeber called bullshit jobs. So today I used to say to the students, what does the UK produce today? We produce meetings, risk assessments, and kind of
Excel spreadsheets.
Yeah, miscellaneous bureaucracy, and it demoralizes people, and they can see the economy collapsing around them. They can see, places, town centres in Rochdale and Burnley struggling because no one's got any money, because the work's gone, and basically the few productive people left have been taxed into oblivion by the government, to
Hmm.
pay for people who they don't know, they don't have any allegiance to, they don't hate these people in the main, um, but who just come over to Britain for the freebies, basically. And then there is a degree of racism there, from the government, in that the government favors these people. It's almost like if
Hmm.
you've not paid into the system, you're more likely to get a council flat. You're more likely to get first choice, school,
And then
because
if you
you're,
are being
you're
supported and
deprived
given
or,
these benefits, you're more
yeah,
likely to then vote in that system to
yeah,
perpetuate it, thus
exactly.
continuing the justification
Yeah,
for the existence of,
yeah.
the government itself, right?
And where there was no racial hatred, there now is, because people just, it's hard for people, they being taxed to death. They're not getting the places. NHS is full up. They can't wait, massive waiting lists. Same with schools, paying an arm and a leg in taxes. No benefits for them. No council flats for their kids. The state is discriminating against them. No free speech for them. People can criticize Christianity, say, for example, but they can't criticize other religions.
Right. Yeah. And that's a perfect segue into the next point. And maybe I see we've got 8 minutes left, so it might be the
Yeah,
last
yeah,
point. But I think worth bringing up is when I've been learning about this group, the Fabian Society, it really stood out to me that they were all atheists. And
yeah,
I think what the language that Rose Martin uses, and I'll just put that book up for anyone who's wondering what book is that I'm talking about. The
yeah,
language that Rose Martin uses is quite religious in the way in how much they were in belief of this system and loyal to it and wanted to use it and push it and spread it and talk about it. They kind of saw socialism as a dogma that they believed in that became their faith, and they had to
yeah,
pursue it no matter what, because you would have to have a faith and a dogmatic belief in it to overlook the harm and the destruction and the death that it had already caused. And so I
yeah,
thought, what are your kind of thoughts there about those links between like
yeah. Well,
socialism as a religion and
100%.
atheism? And
These
yeah.
people are Satanists, so they despise God. They despise God's creation. That's us. They despise the God-given free will that we have. And what they want to do is act as mini little me gods themselves, and tell us how to run our life. And then you get into the order world new, don't you? Reversed. Yeah.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
you you
That's it.
you get into that, and basically the what I've been thinking about recently is the whole European Union. Is I think that's a little trial run of how much they can get away with in towards moving towards an international technocracy where you're just told to suck it up, and your democracy is a sham, and you've just got to be a good obedient citizen and do what you're told to do. And yeah, there's no national sovereignty. It all comes from these experts, you see, and they know far more than you do. And your job is just to be nudged and moved in the right direction and just be an obedient citizen.
And if George Bernard Shaw has his way, every so often you have to stand in front of a panel and prove your
Yeah,
existence and
yeah,
explain what value you're bringing. Otherwise, they're going to get rid of you. And actually, that is now being baked into the way corporations are run in big
yeah.
projects, big scale programs have to
Oh man.
account for social value, and they have a
Yeah,
whole part of the planning which is like, okay, who is this going to benefit and how is it going to benefit them? And you can bet your bottom dollar you better find a way that this is going to benefit minorities and rainbow people. Otherwise, that project is not going to get signed off.
well,
If you
Nick,
say it's going
Nick,
to.
sometimes the future's already arrived and you've not noticed it. So, if we think about in Britain, the National Homicide Society initially, yeah, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, honestly, if I mention even those initials, I've had a video removed for that. So um, most of those people in that organization are hardcore socialists, especially that I used to know somebody that used to work in that, and they're already doing that. They've been bumping off elderly people for years, for decades. They've decided, oh, your life isn't worth living anymore. We're not going to even ask you whether you think your life is worth living, or we won't ask your wife whether she thinks your life is worth living. We're just making a decision for the greater social good. They bumped off. I don't know if I've said this to you before, but they got rid of my dad before, whilst I was, this was, whilst I was still kind of naive to all of this and still trusted these monsters. But
Wow. I had a family member, my grandmother's partner. He went through cancer and went through all the treatment and was making a recovery and beginning to get his appetite back and eating more. And it was still hard for him. But then one night he went into hospital and they went to visit him, and he was in good spirits and he was laughing, and then he just didn't make it through the night. And I
yeah,
always think, how? Because he was on an upswing, and
yeah,
he was never going to live another 20 years, but for some reason he went in, and then overnight something happened. And I always wonder, did something happen? Was a decision made? Was there
yeah,
somebody? Yeah,
100%. A good diath. Um,
yeah,
this is what they've been open about that. Of course, it was the Liverpool Care pathway. That came out in the open. Remember, they always have to seek
of
our
course.
consent, and they've carried on with doing that. So even at somebody of my age, I would be extremely wary of going anywhere near the NHS. Certainly, I wouldn't stay overnight in any NHS facility because somebody might come along and say, "Well, you've had your lot. We don't think
Well,
that your life's worth living anymore. You're
yeah,
not a
that's it.
net
And
to society."
they put themselves, and that's exactly what's coming through in this book, and what you see
Yeah,
when you learn about Sydney and Beatrice Webb. You learn
yeah,
George Bernard Shaw, Bertrand Russell, and interestingly, they set up these organizations, but which are still going. So the Webb set up the London School of Economics, still going today.
yeah,
The Fabian Society still going. There's a picture of Keir Starmer talking to them. There's a group, the Young Fabians, with people who are under 31 years of age. They recently they make a publication every year or so that's named after a H.G. Wells book. H.G. Wells is another one who's kind of, they're lauded and treated as heroes and incredible intellectuals. But if you actually look at what they're saying, these are the kind of people who you should be ashamed to be associated with anything that has anything to do with these people.
but
And yet
what
it's still,
Nick? What these I saw these people at the last private boarding school that I worked at, and it's this authoritarian. They like to think of themselves as being paternalistic, noble, great central planners, and we can make decisions for the greater social good. It's not that we're monsters. Even these people who push like Depop, push kind of Malthusian ideas. It's like, well, for the greater social good, there's too many of, we need to thin the flock. There's too many sheep eating, the grass is too thin. For the good of the flock in the long term, we need to cull half of it. And this is what these people are like. They
it's
act
unbelievable.
like gods, don't they? They pretend that they're gods. Um, think I think again, it's out in plain sight. If you think about those middle class drug pushers, who wear the white coats and stuff, work for the November Hotel Sierra. We often say that many of those people, they act like gods, don't they? And they seem to enjoy the power of determining who's going to live and who's going to die. They get off on it. It's going to run
Absolutely.
out in a minute, Nick, but I hope that's been all right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Fantastic. Very
And
much
if you
in
want to
line with
talk,
what I'm learning, and I appreciate it.
it's a massive conversation, isn't it? And thanks for coming on again. And I'm very happy to carry on and do and answer some more questions because I think it's good. Helps me.
Definitely. We'll
Helps
set that
me.
up.
Yeah, brilliant, Nick. So
Nice
it's going
one.
to cut off in a sec. So all the best, and thanks so much again for coming on. And it's brilliant to see you.
You too. Talk soon.
Cheers. God bless.
God bless.